Inna alhamdulillah, indeed all praise is for Allah. Nahmaduhu, we praise Him. Wa nasta'inuhu, we seek His help. Wa nastaghfiruhu, and we ask His forgiveness. Wa na'udhu billahi min shururi anfusina, and we seek the protection of Allah from the evil of our own souls. Wa min sayyiati a'malina, and from the bad consequences of the evil things that we do. May yahdihillahi fala mudilla lah, whomsoever Allah guides, no one can misguide him. وَمَن يُضْلِلْ فَلَا هَادِيَ لَهُ, and whoever He allows to go astray, no one can thereafter guide him. وَأَشْهَدُ أَن لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهُ وَحْدَهُ لَا شَرِيكَ لَهُ, and I bear witness that there's no deity worthy of worship except for Allah, the one with no partners. وَأَشْهَدُ أَنَّ مُحَمَّدًا عَبْدُهُ وَرَسُولُهُ, and I bear witness that Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is His slave and His messenger. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad, كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders us in the Quran, يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. O you who believe, fear Allah in the way that He's deserving of being feared, and do not die except in a state of submission to Him, except in the state of Islam. Amma ba'd. If you look at some of the current events that we've had in our community. A couple of weeks ago, there was a camp for the young brothers, 40 or 50 of the youth. The same weekend, their care had its annual banquet. Last weekend, there was a class for teaching people how to be a coach for new Muslims. Tomorrow, there's Iman Academy has their gala and fundraiser. There's a silent auction coming up to raise funds for the masjid, a breast cancer walk, all sorts of events, including the parking lot. And if you think about all the ongoing classes and programs that we have going on, and just reflect on that for a moment. This is not an advertisement or the announcements or anything. I mentioned all of these because if you look at all of these events and activities going on, behind each and every one of them are volunteers of people putting in the work. There are people volunteering their time, people who have regular jobs, and many of you are involved in these activities, and you know that firsthand, that you're out there putting in your effort, trying to earn your income for your family, and then out of your extra time, you're putting your effort into these events. And you ask, why would somebody do that? Why would you volunteer for that? And of course, it's for the reward, for the ajr. But there are lots of opportunities to gain the reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We can stay in our home and we can read Quran, and we can pray and we can fast. But these category of events are different. Because not only do we do so seeking that reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but we do so also seeking to benefit people. If you think about all of the events, all of the benefits that we get by being as part of a community, the whole idea of a community is that we work together and we collaborate with each other so that we can benefit each other, so that we can benefit people. And it's because of the very simple fact that we all understand that people are important. That people are important. And then if we keep it in that same context, sometimes, and I speak firsthand from this, sometimes even in organizing those events and working in those things, we get a little bit distracted. Even though we know that the objective is to serve the people and to benefit the people, we get a little bit distracted by the logistics of the event, the attendance and some of the tension aspects. And in the process, we don't pay as much attention as we should to the individuals that are there, that we developed them in the first place to benefit from them. And so the idea is that the most valuable resource we have, the most valuable resource that any community has, are human beings, each other. And at the same time, sometimes the most underappreciated aspect of our communities is the same thing, each other. The one that we take the most for granted. And this doesn't just happen on a community level. It happens in our families. It happens in our circle of friends. It happens all the time anytime we interact with people. That when it really comes down to it, of the most important priorities for us is to value each other, to value each other's existence, and to hold a certain value for each and every human being. And it's something we so easily overlook. My khutbah today will have two parts. The first of which is about measuring that value. How do we establish the value of a person, of a human being? And then the second part will be, as a result of that, what type of expectation should we have of each other? So as for the first one, if you look even in the secular world, in the business world, for example, every decent-sized company has an entire department dedicated to human resources. An entire department that's looking after the people inside of their company, because that's what makes the company work. One company has the following motto: people are essential and fundamental to the existence of an enterprise and business objectives can only be achieved through their dedication and professionalism. So the business world recognizes this. And you see it even in sports. In sports, they have certain accolades and awards, MVPs and all-stars, recognizing that certain individuals, it's their value that brings about the whole entertainment, the whole industry. But the difference between those and Islam is that that recognition of value is based on their contribution. It's based on how much a person is contributing to that company or to that team. But in Islam, is our measurement of value of an individual, is it based on their contribution? And the answer is very clearly no. There's no way that there's no basis to suggest that we value a person by how much we get from them or how much they contribute. In a certain sense, there's a level where you can argue that every human being has a value. One of the very interesting incidents that happened during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ. So sometimes, we have this perception of this huge difference, the way we look at believers and non-believers. But this incident is very clear how the Prophet ﷺ considered every human being to have value. Once a funeral procession passed by him, and he stood up. And so some of the companions were maybe surprised. And they said, it's the funeral procession of a Jew. And he said, but wasn't it a living soul? It's still a soul. So recognizing that every soul deserves a certain amount of respect, a certain amount of recognition that it still has value as a human being. Even after they die, they still deserve that respect. But then there's no doubt about it that we do make a distinction. And there is a certain value that we assign different to others. It's not based on contribution, rather it's based on virtue. And the most explicit evidence of that is where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Hujurat, in the ayah we've heard so many times, Ya ayyuhan nas, inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha, wa ja'alnakum shu'uban wa qaba'ila lita'arafu, inna akramakum 'inda Allah atqakum. Inna Allaha 'alimun khabir. O mankind, we have created you from a male and female, and made you into nations and tribes so that you may know one another. Verily, the most honorable of you with Allah are those who have taqwa, those who are the most conscious of Allah, those who are the most careful of guarding His rights. They are the most honorable in the sight of Allah. Verily, Allah is all-knowing, all-aware. I wanted to share with you a couple of examples from the life of the Prophet ﷺ, how he demonstrated his appreciation of the value of people, and how his measurement of value is so different than so many of other people. Abu Hurairah radiallahu anh, he narrated once that a black person, a male or a female, so even by the narration, they're not even sure, we have so little about this person, we're not even sure if it's a male or a female. They used to clean the masjid, and then they died. The Prophet ﷺ didn't know about it. One day the Prophet ﷺ remembered them and said, what happened to that person? So the people said, Ya Rasulullah, he died. He said, why didn't you inform me? They said, his story was so and so. Basically, they didn't think that he was so significant or she was so significant that the Prophet ﷺ would be, affected by it. And he said, show me the grave. And he went to the grave and performed the funeral prayer. Another example, there were a couple of incidents that happened during the life of the Prophet ﷺ, and they happened at about the same time in the history. One of them is the incident of the well of Ma'una, and another in a place called Ar-Raji'. And they're very similar. In both of these cases, the Prophet ﷺ was requested, he was asked to send some delegations out from his companions so that the people could learn about Islam. And to some extent, he was hesitant about doing so, because you send them out and they're unprotected and they're just going out to teach, so they're not going out like an army. He was hesitant to do so, but he sent them. And to Ma'una, he sent between 40 and 70 of his companions, and at Ar-Raji' it was 10 of them. And for both of them, in both of these incidents, there were acts of treachery, and nearly all of them, with the exception of one or two individuals, were viciously slaughtered. And the news came to the Prophet ﷺ at the same time. What's important to know is that these were not the famous companions that we know about, the Abu Bakr and the Umar and all the others that we're very familiar with the names. That these companions in general were from a group that we know as Ahlus Suffa, the people of the bench. There used to be a place in the masjid, in the back of the masjid, where people who basically didn't have means to survive, they used to inhabit this place, and people used to donate food to them. They used to stay there. In other words, they were homeless. But they were not a disgraceful type. They were not people lacking dignity. In fact, these were of the most righteous of people. These were the people who kept the closest company to the Prophet ﷺ. They were scholars of the Quran. And that's the reason that the Prophet ﷺ chose them for that noble mission of teaching people about Islam. But again, you have to wonder what perspective we would have about those people. Where would we consider them in the classes of society? But this tragedy affected the Prophet ﷺ so much that Anas bin Malik, he said, I never saw the Prophet ﷺ grieve like that. I never saw the Prophet ﷺ grieve like that. And because of these incidents, the Prophet ﷺ, he did qunut in Fajr and Isha, meaning he made like a verbal, out loud dua in the middle of the prayer for one entire month. Again, think about the people that he was doing it for. And what was it about those people that was so special to the Prophet ﷺ? And if you look at the big picture, when we talk about great civilizations, and you think about, civilizations like ancient Egypt and Rome and Greece and the Mayan civilization, you look at the legacy that they left, and it's really just in buildings and in structures that are left behind. But for us, the greatest civilization is that of the Prophet ﷺ and his companions. And we don't have any buildings to look at. We don't have any relics that we relish because of their civilization. The legacy for them is just in human beings. We know names of so many people that in other societies, it's just a couple of names of leaders, and otherwise it's just a general history. But the magnificent legacy of the companions around the Prophet ﷺ is because of individuals. Individuals are who are important. And so if we just reflect then in our perception of others and when we deal with them, what is it that we're really concerned about when we deal with other people? Do we care about their benefit, about their value, their virtue? Or are we seeking what we can gain from them? And if you consider that perspective, and if you deal with people on that account, that each and every person has value according to their virtue, according to their belief, according to their effort, and it doesn't matter at all what they contribute, it totally redefines how we establish our relationships. وَقُلِ قَوْلِ هَذَا وَاسْتَغْفِرُ اللَّهَ. Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. In the first khutbah, I gave some points to establish the fact that every human being has value, and in particular, our value as Muslims is measured by our virtue. It's measured by how close we're trying to come to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how much we're dedicating ourselves to Him. The second part of the khutbah, in the second part, I wanted to have an extension of that. On that basis of every individual has value, what should our expectations of them be? So I want to pose to you a logical argument. If we base our value of people on their qualities and not on their contribution, and then in that case, our care for the person and their life and their afterlife should be separate what they do for us. The logical deduction is then that we should have moderate or limited or maybe even no expectations of the people around us. So just to repeat that, just so that you're clear with the argument I'm proposing here. That if I'm supposed to deal with you in a way where I care about you as an individual, and I'm not caring about what you do for me, then in the practical aspects of life, I shouldn't have excessive expectations of you. Maybe I shouldn't have any expectations of you at all. And that was a logical argument. Does it have a basis in Islam? And I think it's something very clear. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who we know that He created us to worship Him, So as much as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to dedicate ourselves to the worship of Him and to the following of His religion, He has very reasonable and limited expectations of us, and that's on account of our weakness. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala recognizes that we have certain weaknesses, we have certain shortcomings, and even though the very purpose of our life is to worship Him, He has very reasonable expectations of us. Several examples. In the beginning of the 16th verse of Surah At-Taghabun, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ مَسْتَطَعْتُمْ. So have taqwa of Allah. We hear that so many times. Here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala emphasizes or adds a description. Have taqwa of Allah as much as you're able to, as much as you can, according to your capacity. In Surah An-Nisa, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ أَن يُخَفِّفَ عَنْكُمْ وَخُلِقَ الْإِنسَانُ ضَعِيفًا. Allah wishes to lighten the burden for you, and man was created in a state of weakness. In Surah Al-Anfal, الْآنَ خَفَّفَ اللَّهُ عَنْكُمْ وَعَلِمَ أَنَّ فِيكُمْ ضَعْفًا. Now Allah has lightened your task, for He knows in you there is weakness. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as our creator, as our sustainer, the one who knows everything about us, He knows that we're imperfect, He knows that we're weak, He knows that we have shortcomings, and as a result of it, He has very reasonable expectations of us. Once a man came to the Prophet ﷺ and he said, Ya Rasulullah, I may not attend the congregational prayer because so-and-so, referring to the Imam, he prolongs the prayer when he leads us in it. He makes the prayer very long. The narrator said, I never saw the Prophet ﷺ more furious in giving advice than that day. The Prophet ﷺ said, O people, some of you make others dislike doing good deeds. So whoever leads the people in prayer should shorten it, because among them are the sick and the weak and the needy, people who have to go back to work. The Prophet ﷺ was angry because people were making the worship difficult on other people. And so there's this recognition in Islam that we are imperfect and we have some weakness. And even though it's the very purpose of our life, we have, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes statements that He makes it easy for us. And so what you find in Islam are a whole set of concessions where our religion is made easier for us. For example, we're allowed to combine our prayers in certain instances of hardship. Or when we travel, we shorten our prayers because it's an inconvenience for us. If you're fasting, even though fasting is an obligation, due to certain reasons, we're exempt from it. And then there's a whole system of fidya and levels of compensation, that if you're not able to do a certain act of worship, you can make up for it with something else. And if you can't do that, you can make up with something else. And there's so many examples of that. Even something as simple as wiping over the socks. It sounds like a simple idea. But all of you who work, you understand what a nice gift that is to have when you're working in a professional environment, instead of having to wash your feet in the sink when it's time to pray. Little things out of Allah's infinite knowledge that He's done for us to make our lives easier. And those are all examples of our religious duties, the very purpose of our life. And so if that's the case, then how should you and I deal with each other in worldly affairs? If our God, who created us to worship Him, is easy with us in His expectations of that worship, how should I deal with you in our menial worldly affairs? How reasonable expectations should I have? I want to share one example where the Prophet ﷺ, in his perfect example, demonstrates both of the points that I tried to make today in the khutbah, about how he valued, or what he valued rather, in people, and his limited expectations of people. Aisha radiallahu anha, she asked him one day, she said, have you ever encountered a day more difficult than the day of Uhud, when so many companions were killed? This is the day so many companions were killed. The tide was turned on the Muslims. Some of the Muslims didn't follow the orders of the Prophet ﷺ. She said, was there any day more difficult than that? The Prophet ﷺ begins to tell her a story. He said, your tribes have troubled me a lot. And the worst trouble was the trouble on the day of Aqaba, when I presented myself to Ibn Abdul Yalil, Ibn Abdul Kulal, and he didn't respond to my demand. He's referring to the incident of At-Ta'if, when he went to these people and he was rejected. So he goes on how they rejected him. He said, so I departed, overwhelmed with excessive sorrow, and proceeded on, and I couldn't relax till I found myself at Qarn al-Tha'alab, where I lifted my head towards the sky to see a cloud shading me unexpectedly. I looked up and I saw Jibreel in it. He called me saying, Allah has heard your people saying to you, and what they have replied back to you. Allah has sent the angel of the mountain so that you may order him to do whatever you wish to these people. The angel of the mountains called and greeted me, and then said, Ya Muhammad, order whatever you like. If you want, I will let these two mountains fall on them. And here's the Prophet's response. No, but I hope that Allah will let them have children who will worship Allah alone and worship no one besides him. So here the Prophet ﷺ, you couldn't find a more perfect example, I think, to demonstrate what he valued in people, what he was interested in people. Even if not them, maybe their children will come close to Allah. And as far as expectations, not only was he not receiving anything from these people, he went to them for help. He went to them, maybe you'll support the Muslims. Not only did they not support him, they harmed him and they rejected him and they injured him. Even still, the Prophet ﷺ overlooked that in consideration of what was important to him in his dealings with other human beings. So it might sound a little idealistic, but imagine if we dealt with others like this, that we appreciate them for who they are as a person without expecting in return. Imagine how that would redefine every relationship that we have. Carry that into practice. So many, even recently for me, have become exposed to so many couples with marital discord, spouses having problems, and so often it's a very similar theme, that you find that they don't appreciate the other person and they have certain expectations. So they've gone in the opposite extreme. They're not appreciating the good in the person and they're having certain expectations that are not reasonable. So you have a husband who might be working hard and he's not around enough, and so the wife doesn't appreciate that she's not getting enough from him. But he might be a good man. He might be a righteous person who treats her well. Or the vice versa. You find a wife who's maybe not the perfect housewife, but she's righteous. Interesting enough, a very similar incident happened to the Prophet ﷺ. When the Prophet ﷺ wanted to divorce his wife, Hafsa, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed to him, go back to Hafsa, for she fasts a lot and she prays a lot. She is sawama and qawama, and she will be your wife in paradise. So imagine here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling the Prophet ﷺ, overlook whatever it is, whatever disagreement you have with her, because she's a righteous person. Forget your expectations of her and recognize that this is a woman of value. Another example that we can take into our life is how we deal with our children. We talk a lot about how children should have respect and they should be obedient, but we also have a role as parents. And of that role is to love and to accept our children. Our children are very different from us. I can't imagine, for those of you who emigrated from another place, what it was like to have people like us who grew up here who completely different culture. We're so different from you. Even for me, my children are very different from me, and even just the generation different, the way society has evolved. But we still have to have reasonable expectations that we can't expect them to be like us, to have the same mannerisms as us, to be in such a way that we expect them, that they constantly feel disappointed. And are we expressing to them the value? And this is one of the most important points I wanted to relay. What is it that's important to us? What is it that I appreciate in you, my son or my daughter? So many times you find this, and I don't mean to criticize anyone specifically, but you find such a strong emphasis from parents to children on their worldly affairs. In insistence that they have to be a certain profession, or they have to end up in a certain place in their world. And you don't find the emphasis for what will really benefit them in this life and the next. So you've sent a message to them, what is valuable to you? And then you come later. I'll be honest, it happened to me so many times in working with youth, that you find parents bring their teenagers in their elder years, and they have all these problems and they have all these issues, say, can you help my son? And I feel like telling them, but you didn't teach them what was valuable to you long ago when it was important. Now you recognize that it was much more valuable. It would have been much better for them to teach them the morals and the manners and how to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how to follow His rules over everybody else's. If we don't teach our children that value, that's what's important, that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala considers important, how are they ever going to recognize it? And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us to value each other for our virtue and for our closeness and nearness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bring us close to Him. and to make us to be dedicated to Him in our worship and in our life. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive us for our sins and our shortcomings, and to make us to have reasonable expectations of each other. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to gather us in a gathering better than us in Al-Jannah. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. سبحان الله بحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك.